Welcome to another broadcast of the Debra Rufini Show on the ArtistFirst Radio Network. All past shows are archived. You can find them at ArtistFirst.com. And now, from England, here she is, your host, Debra Rufini.
Greetings from England. This is Debra Rufini with another edition of the Debra Rufini Show. Today, I want to explore the possibility of who is God and if there's a possible link between religious faith and narcissism. Incidentally, sorry, you're going to have to excuse me. I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm hoping my voice doesn't conk out. And I have no guest. It's only me here, so do excuse me. I hope I don't have a coughing fit. It's a change of the weather in Britain at the moment. It's gone from very cold to quite warm. The colds go around. This is something that's been quite close to my heart recently because I've been in touch with a few people who have been affected by, not God, but by religious faith and the people that claim to represent God, causing some harm and turning them away from the church. And I've done a few shows about spiritual abuse, and it's just something I've just had some thoughts the other day that I thought maybe I would just do a one woman show about this, and just to share some thoughts that I've come up with. I think there are, this is my own observation in life, I think there's two types of Christians. I think you've got a kind of narcissistic Christian who operates from a place of ego and feels it's their job to look down on everyone else and judge them. And then I think you've got the more humble, sincere Christians who show love, speak love, and leave the judgment in God's hands. And surely that's what we're called to do. But I wonder if I've touched on a possible link that can sometimes be found between Christianity and narcissism. And anything I say here, I don't want to sound blasphemous because I was raised in the Christian faith. I'm by no means an atheist. I'm a mustard seed Christian. And something, we're all a work in progress, and I think life is just full of experiences, teach us our beliefs, the conclusions we come to, our findings. And that's part of the reason that I hope God is a bit more easier on us than maybe what we're meant to believe or told to believe. But if you think about it, if the fundamentals of Christianity is acknowledging that we're full of sin, in need of a saviour, and that we're guilty people, yet with our slate wiped clean upon repentance, could it be that in many cases one takes this to the extreme in using it as a form of self-righteous projection onto those who haven't had their slate wiped clean? A sort of, I'm right, Jack, but you're in deep trouble. I'm in God's good books, which leaves me in a position to judge your state of salvation before him, because God lives in me, so there. It makes you feel like that sometimes. Fine examples of Christian narcissism can be found, I'm very much aware of this, amongst the YouTube comments relating to such topics as homosexuality. For instance, a documentary on the history of HIV, where your average comments are humble, kind, considerate, compassionate, and recognising that the orientation itself is not one of choice. Then, sticking out like a sore thumb amongst them, you'll find, in inverted commas, homos burn in hell, gay sex is abomination before God. And it's said with sort of such delight in a thuggish tone. There will also be those comments which are written as parrot fashion, repetition from the pulpit, speaking of the sinful lifestyle, with no consideration for same-sex attraction being sincere, only deliberate rebellion against God. and AIDS being a plague of wrath sent by God, which everyone who contracts it supposedly deserves, even if it's contracted through the mother to our unborn baby or through blood transfusion. It's almost like there's no brain behind the comment. The only motive is to provoke through anger, not to introduce the Lord at all. The nature of the remark is rude, it's arrogant, self-righteous, patronising, spoken like a point-scoring, argumentative, insecure bully, just wanting to feed their holy ego. There is zero compassion in the tone, irrespective of whether something is sin or not. A complete misrepresentation of Christ, and using their Bible to sling mud. They completely and conveniently ignore Jesus' words to the thief next to him on the cross concerning his last-minute plea, and the gentle approach Jesus used in dealing with the woman caught in the act of adultery, and his words to the hypocrites regarding removal of plank from own eye before attempting removal of speck in another. These people are responsible for turning others away from the church, yet have the sheer cheek to blame them for their backsliding, taking no responsibility for their actions, but rather passing the buck in blaming Satan for what they're guilty of. Oh, sorry, it makes me hopping mad. A difference of approach can make the world of difference in a heart. Then to top it all, when you dare to comment in kindness against the nature of their tone, they place themselves even higher on their pedestal by their apparent God-given right to speak to you how they jolly well please, and become the ultimate judge on your standing before God and the state of your salvation, basically because you've spoken against them, where to their mind the true Christ dwells alone. This is not Christianity, this is narcissism at its finest. And it's just very sad. Now, I responded to one of these charming people, that is a joke, kindly inviting them to examine their comment. And guess what I received in return? I was told that I worship the devil, that I was going to hell, and to get my life right with God. Wow, that's an assumption and a half, I would say. So brave of this person to act on behalf of God. And they don't see this at all as blasphemous. God doesn't call us to judge, he calls us to love. I replied saying how sarcastically, so maybe I was just as childish as him, but I replied sarcastically saying how heaven would be such a lonely place with only him and Westboro Baptist there. And speaking of which, Westboro Baptist interestingly claim to not win people for Christ, but rather that their job is to make people aware of how sinful they are, while there is no hope or salvation on offer for them. So if these people are fags, I understand. In Britain, fags means a cigarette, so it's kind of a funny term for us. But fags, I take it in America, is very slang and not very kind to homosexuals, derogatory. So if homosexuals and is it fag enablers, they say, I'm just going by their ridiculous banners they hold up. If these awful sinners are beyond redemption, it begs the question, what is the purpose of the mission of Westboro Baptist? It's purely to bully in order to feed their ego. A lovely couple from my old church come to mind, so I don't want to, got to be careful, I don't want to badmouth them, because I think their heart was in the right place. But this was many years ago, they gave me a book where it was a book about my sin, my own sin. We all have different sins, we all have weaknesses with sin. But they had taken the trouble to buy me this book about my own sin. And they had highlighted in, I think it was luminous yellow marker pen, all the parts about God's wrath and how I'm heading for hell. Gee, thanks. That was beautiful. Now, think again, like Westboro, and I'm not comparing this lovely couple to Westboro Baptist, but think about the mind behind this. I don't think it's of any coincidence that many activist atheists were once former Christians. I'm rather sceptical of many church leaders who have been called, if you like, into the ministry. Have they really? Or is it something that they just want to do in order to tell everyone else what to do? Where they can be, I don't know what's the word. They can't be argued with, I guess. I think that's what I'm trying to say. They can't be argued with because God has appointed me, we're the chosen people. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe that many church leaders are sincere. But I believe that many are only in it to feed their ego and be in a position of power and control. I can think of two power-hungry individual people that I knew, attention-seeking people who you could look at them and think, oh, they're really lovely, look at how giving they are. But I think sometimes, again, with narcissism, it can be love bombing, where you're doing it just for show and to get attention and have the ego fed. Are you doing it to give? Are you doing it because you have a heart for humanity, or is it just so that you can be adored? So I'm thinking of these two people from my past, in particular, two people that I used to know who were very, very power hungry, and lo and behold, they're now church ministers. Seems a bit odd. Bit too convenient. Was that truly the calling of God? Or did they decide that God had called them? Perhaps a little arrogant. The last church I attended, again, was led by a power-hungry man who would endlessly brag about his church being the largest in the city. There would always be, often, not always, often be an appeal at the end for those to give their lives to Christ. But he would be treating it a bit like an auction. He'd be saying, giving the prayer, would anyone like to, if you've heard this message and it's touched your heart, we're now going to have a time of prayer, heads down, no one else is going to see you. And then, if you could raise your hand if you would like to respond to what I've said and it all makes sense. So he would be kind of saying, thank you, sir, I see you there at the back there. Do we have a number 2? Number 2, thank you, madam. I see you over there. Do we have number 3? Come on now, come on, is there a number 3? Yep, I see your hand, thank you, sir. And it would very much be, it sounds crazy, but it did feel like it was more of an auction, and let's see how many more we can get in this church. And that's brilliant to get numbers to make the church bigger is brilliant, but as long as it's for the right reason, as long as it's to spread the message rather than it's my church, it's the biggest and the best, that's completely different. So yeah, I couldn't help but feel that in that case it was more about gaining popularity. At this point, I can't emphasise enough how I am far from atheist, because I this in effect is quite a negative show because it's dealing with negative subject matter, but I hope and pray positive that it will help people avoid narcissistic leaders, being under the control of narcissistic church leaders, and avoid or deal with spiritual abuse. We shouldn't have to deal with it, but avoid spiritual abuse. So I hope in that sense this show is going to be positive. So yeah, I think there's a massive difference between religion and belief in God. I don't think belief in God is harmful at all, and it can be of great comfort. I personally, I mean, we haven't got enough time for me to give my story. My dad's a retired church minister, still preaches, brilliant man, brilliant preacher. I'm not being biased because he's my dad, he is. Even if he wasn't my dad, I would still say the same. But there's always been many questions that I've struggled with. And I think they're questions that a lot of people think about, but maybe they're too scared to think about. What's God going to think if we think, oh my goodness, because God is all powerful, and the very fact that he created a place called hell to begin with, that makes him quite petrifying. You know, that is quite a scary character. The reason I'm not an atheist is because I think the atheist stumbling block is, in order to believe in God, you must answer the question, what created God? But I think with that, you're left with, it's a difficult one, you're left with two possibilities. Either everything came from nothing, all the complexity that we have before us came from nothing, or everything came from something. Now, accidents and chaos, if you start with this random Big Bang, and incidentally, what was it that went bang? That there's still just so much we don't know. But yeah, accidents and chaos cause further chaos, not order. And time and space alone don't account for design. To give an illustration of this, if you were to have a pack of cards and throw them up into the air forever, they will never fall down to create and produce a perfect card castle. That takes design, it takes engineering work. The complexity of DNA is it. I do think, I mean, we've heard it time and again, and I'm sure atheists must find it patronising, but I think it does take more faith to be an atheist than a theist. That's just from my perspective, and we're going to deal with belief and disbelief a little bit in a bit. So yeah, to my mind, there has to be an uncaused cause in order for the complexity of life and the universe. Richard Dawkins has actually said that the universe existing is most improbable, yet it does exist. So it's strange why he can't apply the same train of thought to God. I think there's a few inconsistencies that Dawkins has come out with that he hasn't really thought through. I think something that is improbable doesn't make it impossible, and there are lots of things we have in life that are very improbable, but they are here. So I don't think that God is a ridiculous idea, concept. But I think sometimes we forget just how big God is, and we can consequently limit him to our belief of him. To my mind, in order for God to be love, I've got to be very careful how I say this, because I don't want it to sound like I don't have the faith. But again, I think there's, and some of the things I'm going to mention here, I hope that it's going to help people, even if it's, oh my goodness, I've thought that too, but I haven't liked to dwell on it because I shouldn't be thinking this. But God has given us brains, and we're not going to get everything right. So I've got to be careful in saying, I think there must be something more to salvation than the salvation prayer alone, because in effect that would be just like getting the golden ticket, where God is not examining the contents of our hearts. And the salvation prayer alone would consequently have God, in many cases, rewarding bad behaviour and punishing good behaviour if he's going to ignore how we've lived and ignore how easy it is to make simple errors of misjudgment. I mean, we've all... Think how easy it is to get an appointment wrong. Oh, I thought it was on Tuesday. No, it's not. I've just looked in my diary. It's on Thursday. It's very easy to make errors of misjudgment, and in our imperfect humanness, we do it all the time. But this one error of misjudgment, in failing to recognise the true God, costs us everything, where he will cast us into an eternal torturous pit, all because we've got it wrong in our human imperfection. Now, would that be a loving God? Just think about that for a moment. Would that actually be a loving God who isn't big enough to read our hearts and see reasons? So it would kind of be, for those who have got God right, who have cracked the code, can go on then to make any number of mistakes, but they're still saved. Yet those who have made this one sincere mistake in not knowing who God is, or not believing in God, have had it. That's... Again, I don't think you can get an all-knowing God out of that. Wouldn't that make God quite an OCD character by nature, where it's all about him and not about us? If God is unable to understand that for some of his own creation it's a difficult thing to believe, if he is unable to examine our hearts, he's not an all-knowing God. I absolutely love Christian apologetics. I'm a massive lover of William Lane Craig. I think he's a very clever bloke. I wish more atheists... I wish Richard Dawkins would debate him. From what I understand, the last I knew, Richard Dawkins refuses to debate William Lane Craig, which is a shame, because that would be a very, very interesting show. But it deeply frustrates me that it almost feels as if with apologetics they've been programmed in robot fashion to speak the words they speak with regard to disbelief. There is a massive difference between belief and choice. The two just aren't the same. But so many people of faith don't seem to understand that belief is completely secular to choice. Sincere disbelief in God is not deliberate rebellion against him. And even growing up, I always struggled with this in the church, that, you would hear week after week from the pulpit about people. You would constantly hear the word disbelief married up to rebellion. And it's something that never made sense to me then, and it doesn't make any sense to me now. But it's almost like you put this to theists, and that they must understand what you're trying to say, but it's almost like they don't want to think about it, they don't want to consider it. We cannot believe something merely because we're told to believe it. That just doesn't work. I mean, think about it. Think of something that you absolutely believe in, and now trying your hardest to imagine that you don't believe in it. It doesn't work like that. Belief is just your own standing of how it is. There's no choice involved. I'm a huge Bruce Springsteen fan, and if a friend came to my house and absolutely insisted that on their way round here they had passed Bruce Springsteen sat on the park bench, and all excited they weren't a fan, but they were all excited on my behalf. Deborah, come on, you got to see this. I don't understand it, but he's here. He's literally just 2 blocks away. I'm sure it's him. Come with me. I think my natural, my brain just would not believe it. There'd be no rebellion involved. I would love to believe that he was round there, sat on a park bench, just waiting for me to sit next to him and ask him what downbound train is all about. But but I think my natural heart would just, I wouldn't bother to get, if it was cold, I wouldn't bother to get my coat on and say, oh bless you, that's really sweet of you, but I'm quite happy indoors, thanks. Now that would be evidence in itself that I naturally would not believe what my friend was telling me. And I would require evidence. Even if my friend was being a real pain in the butt and forced me to get my coat on and get ready and leave my nice cosy house, I still think that if I was stood right in front of Bruce Springsteen, sat on that park bench, I think I would be in a state of shock. And even then, and this does sound like I would just be argumentative or rebellious for the sake of it. But even then, because it's something I really wouldn't expect, I would even question whether it was really him. Am I dreaming? Is it a lookalike? I would still be, and that's no one's fault. That wouldn't be anyone's fault. That it wouldn't be his fault. It wouldn't be my fault. It wouldn't be my friend's fault. The fact that I would be doubtful about it is because all this time I have not believed he was there. So seeing him right in front of me, I would still struggle with the belief. You hear many people, I've heard this so many times, many people of faith say that it's our job to search. But the problem with that is if you're not aware of anything to search for, you're not going to search. And if you believe that you've already arrived at your truth, that's held in a different faith, for example, you're not going to continue the search. It's a bit like if I've already found my keys that I've been looking for, and I believe that they are my door keys, I'm not going to continue the search. That would just be silly. There's no reason for me to continue the search if I absolutely believe what I've arrived, that I found them. There wouldn't be any point in carrying on looking. And how would an unconditionally, that's the key word here, unconditionally loving God, how would an unconditionally loving God be angry at this? Would you be angry if someone you knew didn't recognise you in the street? even if the person you knew deliberately ignored you, would you punish them eternally through a horrific means if you could? That's pretty severe. But we're dealing with a loving God, a loving, not only a loving God, an unconditionally loving God, and a God who is understanding. Back in the 1960s, way before my time, well, actually, unfortunately, not way before my time, but was before my time. I don't know if it made the news in America, but over here, that you may have heard of the Moors murders. It was a couple called Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, and they took children and killed them in the most horrific means possible. They would record them screaming, and they would send tape recordings to the children's parents. I mean, I'm not a parent, but that just makes me, horrid, to say the least. Words fail me with that one. Not a nice couple. Yeah, I believe they were a couple. I don't think they were friends. I believe they were a couple. So both Myra Hindley and Ian Brady died in prison. And we're talking more recent years. I mean, I think Myra Hindley died. It doesn't really matter, but I think she died sort of maybe turn of the millennium, and Ian Brady died within the last few years. But Myra Hindley gave her life to Christ just before she died. And I guess the awesome thing about the forgiveness of God is that there is no sin too big for him to forgive, and that we can all have a second, third, fourth chance as we all screw up. And that is great. That is brilliant news, because we all fall short. Now, all the murdered children were found. They were buried in the moors. I think this was in and around Manchester way. So the children were found -1, which was 12-year-old Keith Bennett. Now, Keith Bennett's mother, Winnie Johnson, she spent the rest of her tortured life in the hope of her baby boy being found, so that she could lay him to rest. If I remember rightly the story, I don't think Myra Hindley remembered where they had buried Keith. And you've got to remember, to these two despicable creatures, you know, these kids were just entertainment for them, and, you know, they weren't somebody's son or daughter, friend. So they just were just numbers to these awful people. But Ian Brady went to his grave refusing to say where he and Myra buried Keith. I think he knew. He remembered where they had buried Keith. Now, Winnie Johnson, because there was a documentary a few years ago about this, and I remember just sobbing. And this is why I'm mentioning this story and my observation about this, because this is what got me thinking about belief in God, whether it's choice, what's the difference between choice and belief? Anyway, I'm wondering. So they interviewed Winnie Johnson, and she was such a gentle little soul, very sweet old lady by this time. And she passed away not too long ago. She never got to lay Keith to rest. And that when they interviewed her, it was so sad, because she was just so placid and humble, really sweet, just saying, well, I know my Keith's here. So she was interviewed like on the moors, and she was saying, oh, I know my Keith is here somewhere, and I really hope before I die that they will get to find him. Now, I know nothing of her Winnie Johnson's walk with the Lord. That's God's business alone. But let's say that in her devastation, she quite naturally came to the conclusion that there was no protector God in the equation. Now that would be understandable, wouldn't it? If you think about it. I mean, I can't even, like I say, I'm not a parent, but I can't even wrap my head around how that would feel. Because I would imagine that to lose a child is bad enough, but to have your child murdered, I mean, that's enough to drive you insane, isn't it? So you can understand for someone who's had their child murdered in a horrible way and had to listen to the recordings of these kids were screaming for mummy on these recordings. That is just enough to drive you absolutely mad. So let's just for example, that Keith's mum just felt there was no God, no protector God in the equation. No rebellion, just an honest disbelief. She may have even forgiven Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, but so no bitterness, but just devastation and sincere disbelief. She had a life of hell while here on earth, suffering at the hands of these two awful individuals. I can't actually think of any word in the English language to, probably something that I wouldn't be allowed to say on air anyway. So what these two did to her beloved son, she gave her a life of absolute hell. Just think about this, okay? Monster Myra Hindley utters her apology to God, sincere as it may have been, yet still, after doing what she had done, she goes on to live in eternal glory, while poor little Winnie J may well have been provoked to disbelief due to Myra Hindley's behaviour, and she consequently goes on to suffer an eternal hell on top of the hell she's already suffered on earth. Now, this documentary really hit me, and it got me sincerely questioning the traditional Christian faith, that it's just cut and dry, salvation prayer, go on to eternal glory. That's it. Again, like I've already said, well, that would include God punishing bad behaviour and rewarding... Sorry, no, let me get that right. Punishing good behaviour and rewarding bad behaviour. That's it. Got there in the end. And you think, well, no. I don't want to repeat myself, but I'm just going over this in my head. I just don't think I would worship that God out of fear. I don't know if I could feel love for that God. And I think sometimes we forget that originally God gave us free will, knowing what we would do with that free will. Because of original sin, we have no choice but to be born in sin. We're born with a kind of sin gene, if you like, where humanity thereon must pay for original sin, if not for Jesus. Now, this is an interesting thing. We're also told that Jesus is what we don't deserve. But what would God be like if he conditioned it that way at the start, then not send Jesus, if Jesus is the only way back to him? An all-loving and just God wouldn't blame it back on us, something beyond our control, then punish us even further if we fail to recognise the way back. That is not love. That is abuse. Do you know, as I'm speaking, I actually feel really guilty saying all this. Just the very fact that I am thinking about it. And it's really going against the grain of what I've been taught all my life. I feel kind of that I'm kicking my parents in the teeth, whom I love deeply. I feel that I'm kicking my Christian friends in the teeth, and my people I've known along the way, and even those that I'm saying I used to know and they're now in positions of ministry, and was it from ego or was it genuinely the Lord's calling? But we mustn't be not made to feel, we mustn't feel guilty, surely, just over thinking. Things that don't make sense, we can't just blindly believe. We've got to think these things through. And I'm in no way saying that I don't believe Jesus is the saviour of the world. Again, I can't repeat enough. I keep saying I'm covering myself. I'm very much aware that I'm covering myself here. That I am a mustard seed Christian, and I really hope that one day it grows. But all I'm saying is that there are things that we're expected to believe in that do not fall hand in hand with an all-loving, unconditionally loving God. There are things that we assume to be the absolute truth that wouldn't be likely. When you examine it, there's just things that... I just think there's a lot of things that we believe we know that we will never know this side of life, and thank goodness, because I think our heads would explode. And we can't make something true just because we believe it. Isn't that the beauty of God, that we are so much smaller and far less informed than him? And the best we can do in life is believe and accept to the best of our ability. And surely God would respect and accept that. We cannot do more than this. We cannot give any better than our best. And I just really hope that it is enough for him. You go to church and it's almost like there's so many things you're expected to get right. And even sometimes, I'm going back to my memories of being in church, which is I can't think how long it's been. It's been a long time. And part of me would like to go back. But I think I'm also very much aware of that there's too much to have to go along with, that even if you don't agree with, you're expected to go along with it. And then there could be like a discussion group or something, and anything you say, because there's too much that doesn't make sense, that we're just expected to believe because the Bible says so, and we're not allowed to translate it this way, we're not allowed to translate it that way, we're not even allowed to question, or if we do, again, the whole point, we're being argumentative. My fear of going back to the church is because I've learnt so much about narcissism now because of my past relationships. I've had 2 relationships with narcissists that I've mentioned on a previous show. Now I'm gemmed up on narcissism. I would no longer be a timid little Debra that doesn't say anything, that just keeps her mouth shut. I would have to be a bit outspoken if there was something that I found wasn't quite right, or could possibly be damaging, was bordering on abuse, could be harmful to people. But that would make me come across as argumentative, and I wouldn't want to do that, and I wouldn't want to help ruin anyone else's walk with the Lord if they're buying all of it and not questioning all of it, and they're having a blind or maybe semi-sighted faith. I wouldn't want to do that, because in a sense I would much rather have a blind faith, and it would make facing death a lot easier, to not have all these questions and not have this fear of knowing that this God did create hell, and those who everything hangs on the salvation prayer. That is quite a scary thing. So these things I'm mentioning they're not strictly my beliefs, but they are questions with the belief that I've been expected to believe in, provided you're a genuine Christian. You've got to be going on the same way as all of us. That's the thing here. And so if I went back into church, I'd have all that again. Maybe not initially, but it would have to be, you're not one of us, you're a bit, fallen by the wayside if you don't see it this way, because this is the only way of seeing it. So yeah, for anyone out there who is struggling with faith, hang on in there, and don't beat yourself up, as God knows you better than anyone, which leaves you only accountable to God, no one else. No one else is allowed to judge you. Don't allow another human to judge you, as we are all imperfect, even those who believe they're in a place of authority over your salvation. It's just, even saying that, it's just taking me back to those YouTube comments. It's just incredible. Those that they're not trying to win anyone for Christ by the name calling, the patronising anger, really. Yeah, they're not bearing things in mind. They're not, like I say, the how Christ dealt with the thief on the cross next to him and the woman caught in the act of adultery. They're not thinking of the loving Jesus. They're just taking it upon themselves to be mini gods and the judge of everyone else's heart. So yeah, don't allow anyone else to damage your walk with God. It could even be the most effective way for the enemy to operate through people of faith, because that would make sense, wouldn't it? Because if God does want you to come to him and believe in him and have a strong faith in him, the best person for Satan to work through would be another Christian, sorry, not just theist, would be another theist who the receiver maybe respects and looks up to. That makes sense, I think, why so many people have walked away from the church, because they've had ministers, people in authority who they've respected. Again, I can't emphasise enough, operating from ego, not from love, and being made to feel rubbish. And so it turns them away. Doesn't just turn them away from the church, it turns them away from their faith, and then they question God, because if they've looked up to a minister, a person in a position of authority, and this person is God-filled, well, who's God then? And that is the importance. A wonderful Christian friend of mine, who I can't include in any of what I've mentioned in this show, because she's not one of the not one of the categories that I've been speaking about. But she actually said to me a while ago that it's so important to follow Jesus and not Christians. And that has helped me a lot, and that has meant so much to me. Because I do think in a severe case you could actually become atheist through following Christians who are mean, abusive, narcissistic, and just make it their duty to go round telling people off. And it's so important to follow God. But then if you don't believe in God, again, all you can do is the best you can with the belief you have. And I still just hope that God will respect that and realise that is not rebellion. He is God. He's God. He knows everything. So, thanks for tuning in. And I do hope that this has helped and help protect people and help people with their faith as well. But don't let anyone damage your faith. So stay safe, and there are lots of good organisations about spiritual abuse. There's some good Facebook groups. Just trying to think of some names. There'll be some links on my homepage to brilliant supportive organisations for victims of spiritual abuse. People who haven't lost their faith, but they are just being careful and cautious. So those will be on the ArtistFirst, my homepage. So until next time, lots of love and God bless. Thanks for tuning in. Goodbye.